The first time Nina drove through the village, she thought it was quaint. The narrow cobblestone streets were lined with crooked houses, their windows glowing faintly in the evening light. A soft mist clung to the air, giving the place an almost magical charm. She hadn't planned on stopping. Her destination was hours away, and the approaching dusk had already painted the sky in shades of orange and crimson. But as her car sputtered and coughed, she knew she didn't have a choice. The gas station on the edge of the village seemed abandoned, its rusted pumps leaning at odd angles. Nina frowned as she pulled in, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. "Perfect," she muttered, stepping out of the car. The air was colder than she expected, the mist thickening as she approached the station's office. The windows were grimy, and the faint glow of a flickering bulb inside was the only sign of life. Nina knocked on the door. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out, but the screen showed no signal. With a sigh, she pushed the door open. The bell above it jingled weakly, and the stale smell of oil and mildew hit her immediately. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes staring at something unseen. He didn't react as Nina approached. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a polite smile. "My car broke down, and I need some help." "Do you sell gas here?" The man's head turned slowly, his movements unnervingly stiff. His lips parted, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "You shouldn't stay here." Nina blinked. I just need gas," she said. The man's hollow eyes fixed on her, and he leaned forward. "The road doesn't let people leave," he said. Nina stepped back, her pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" The old man didn't answer. He simply gestured to a dusty map pinned to the wall behind him. Nina turned to look. The map showed the village and the surrounding area, but the road she had been driving on was missing. "Where's the highway?" she asked, her voice unsteady. The man didn't respond. Before Nina could press him further, the bell above the door jingled again. She turned to see a young boy standing in the doorway, his face streaked with dirt. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said, his voice eerily calm. Nina's chest tightened. "Look, I just need gas. Can someone please help me?" The boy and the old man exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the old man pointed to a pump outside. "Fill up," he said, "but if you hear the bell, don't stop. Keep driving." Nina's hands trembled as she filled the tank. The pump creaked and groaned, the gas flowing sluggishly. She glanced over her shoulder at the mist-shrouded village, unease prickling at the back of her neck. The old man's warning echoed in her mind. "If you hear the bell, don't stop." The moment her tank was full, she climbed back into her car and started the engine. The sound was a welcome relief, breaking the oppressive silence. As she drove through the village, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The houses seemed darker now, their windows like empty eyes. And then, faintly, she heard it. A bell. At first, she thought it was in her head. But as she drove on, the sound grew louder, its hollow chime reverberating through the air. The mist thickened, swallowing the road ahead. Nina gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The bell rang again, closer this time. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road behind her, barely visible through the fog. It was tall and thin, its outline unnaturally sharp against the haze. Nina's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal. The bell rang once more, and this time the figure was closer. Nina's breath came in short gasps as she focused on the road ahead, refusing to look back. The car's headlights cut through the mist, revealing more of the cobblestone street. But the village didn't end. House after house passed by, each one identical to the last. The same broken shutters, the same flickering lights. It was as if the road was looping, trapping her in an endless cycle. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening." The bell rang again, deafening now, and her car lurched violently. "No!" Nina screamed as the steering wheel jerked out of her hands. the car veering off the road and skidding to a halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving Nina in silence. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the door handle, stumbling out of the car. The mist was thicker now, wrapping around her like a living thing. The bell rang once more, and Nina turned slowly. The figure was standing just a few feet away. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured, but its presence radiated an overwhelming sense of dread. "You shouldn't have stopped," it said, its voice a low, guttural whisper. Nina's legs refused to move, her body frozen in place. The figure stepped closer, and the last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was its hollow, glowing eyes. When Nina woke, she wasn't in her car anymore. She was lying on a cold cobblestone street. The mist hung low, thick, and heavy, muffling every sound. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. Her head throbbed as she sat up, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The houses around her were unfamiliar, their crooked frames leaning at odd angles. The village was silent, eerily so, with no sign of life. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The last thing she remembered was the figure with the glowing eyes. But now, it was gone. Nina stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. Her car was nowhere to be seen. Panic flared in her chest as she turned in a slow circle, searching for anything familiar. But the village looked different now. Darker, older, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The mist seemed alive, swirling around her feet and crawling up the walls of the houses. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. She called out, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Her words echoed faintly, swallowed by the mist. And then, faintly, she heard it again. The bell. The sound was distant at first, but it sent a chill down her spine. Nina's heartbeat quickened as the bell rang again, louder this time, its hollow chime reverberating through the empty streets. She turned toward the sound, her legs moving on their own. The cobblestone path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the village. The houses grew closer together, their windows shattered and dark. Ivy crawled up their walls, and the air grew colder with every step. Finally, she reached the village square. At its center stood an ancient clock tower, its face cracked and covered in moss. The bell was ringing from somewhere within, its chime echoing through the still air. Nina hesitated, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The tower loomed over her, its jagged silhouette cutting through the mist. Something about the tower felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. Its wooden door was slightly ajar, the faint glow of candlelight spilling through the crack. Nina's hands trembled as she pushed the door open. The air inside was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of wax and mildew. The bell rang again, louder now, and Nina's ears rang from the sound. The narrow staircase spiraled upward, its steps worn and uneven. She placed a hand on the railing, the wood smooth and cold beneath her fingers. "Just find someone," she muttered to herself. "Anyone." Her voice echoed faintly as she began to climb. The higher she climbed, the darker it became. The glow of the candlelight faded, replaced by an oppressive blackness that seemed to press against her. The bell rang again, shaking the walls of the tower. Nina froze, her chest tightening. For a moment she thought she heard something else. Faint whispers, just beneath the chime. "Who's there?" she called, her voice unsteady. The whispers stopped. Nina swallowed hard and continued upward, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Finally, she reached the top of the tower. The bell was enormous, its surface tarnished and cracked. A thick rope hung from it, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. But it wasn't the bell that caught her attention. Standing in the shadows was a woman. Her back was to Nina, her long black hair cascading down her tattered dress. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly to the side. "Excuse me," Nina said cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't move. Nina took a step closer. "I'm lost. And The woman turned suddenly, and Nina's breath caught in her throat. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and unblinking. But it was her mouth that sent a chill down Nina's spine. Her lips were sewn shut. The woman raised a hand, pointing toward the bell. Nina's heart raced as she stumbled back. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The woman's sewn lips didn't move, but a faint whisper filled the air, curling around Nina like smoke. "Ring the bell. And remember." Nina's pulse thundered in her ears. "I don't understand," she said. The woman's hand remained outstretched, her expression unchanging. The whisper came again, softer this time. "Ring the bell. And remember." Nina's eyes darted to the rope hanging from the bell. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the tower and never look back. But something about the woman's whisper pulled at her, a strange familiarity that she couldn't explain. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for the rope. The moment her fingers closed around it, a sharp jolt shot through her, and the world seemed to tilt. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. Nina yanked the rope, and the bell let out a deafening chime. The air around her shattered like glass. The tower dissolved into darkness, and Nina felt herself falling, weightless and disoriented. Images flashed before her, fragments of memories she didn't recognize. A child running through the mist. A man with hollow eyes and a painted smile. A hand reaching out from the shadows. And then a voice. "You can't escape the village. It's part of you now." Nina gasped as she hit the ground, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the village square. But it wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood in the mist, their outlines faint and flickering. Some were children, their faces pale and wide-eyed. Others were adults, their expressions blank and lifeless. They stared at Nina, their presence oppressive and unnerving. The woman from the tower stood among them, her sewn lips still, her unblinking eyes fixed on Nina. "What do you want from me?" Nina whispered, her voice trembling. The figures didn't respond, but from somewhere deep within the mist, the bell rang again. And the whispers returned. The figures didn't move. They stood motionless in the mist, their blank eyes fixed on Nina. Each one looked like a faded photograph, their features blurred and incomplete, as if they didn't fully belong to the world around them. Nina's chest tightened as the bell rang again, its haunting chime reverberating through the air. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around her like cold fingers. "Find the truth! The past is calling!" "What truth?" Nina shouted, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't respond, but then, slowly, one of them stepped forward. It was a boy, no older than 10, his face pale and smeared with dirt. He clutched a stuffed animal tightly in his hands, a rabbit with one missing ear. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Nina's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to come here," she said. I just need to leave." The boy shook his head. "No one leaves." The other figures began to move now, their steps slow and deliberate as they surrounded her. Panic surged in Nina's chest as she backed away. "Why can't I leave?" she demanded. "What is this place?" The boy's hollow eyes locked on hers. "This is where the lost come to stay," he said, "and now you're one of us." The words sent a chill down Nina's spine. "I'm not staying here," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "I'll find a way out." The boy tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "There is no way out," he said. "Not unless you remember." "Remember what?" Nina asked, frustration and fear twisting in her gut. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and pressed the stuffed rabbit into her hands. "Go to the lake," he said softly. "The answers are there." Before Nina could respond, the figures faded into the mist, their forms dissolving like smoke. The silence that followed was deafening. Nina looked down at the rabbit in her hands. Its fur was matted and stained, its one remaining button eye staring blankly up at her. The whispers were gone now, replaced by the soft rustling of the mist around her. But the boy's words echoed in her mind. Go to the lake. Taking a deep breath, she tucked the rabbit under her arm and began walking. The cobblestone streets gave way to a dirt path, and the air grew colder with each step. The trees around her were tall and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. It wasn't long before she saw the faint shimmer of water through the mist. The lake was eerily still, its surface like a sheet of glass reflecting the gray sky above. The mist clung to the shoreline, curling around the rocks and trees like a living thing. Nina approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers returned, faint and melodic, drifting across the water. Remember, remember. She knelt by the edge of the lake, her fingers brushing against the cold, damp earth. The rabbit felt heavier in her hands now, as if it carried the weight of the memories she couldn't reach. What am I supposed to remember? She whispered. The water rippled, and an image began to form on its surface. It was a memory, hers, but distant and blurry, like a dream she'd forgotten. She saw herself as a child, standing at the edge of this very lake. Beside her was a woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. Her mother. The memory sharpened, and Nina's breath caught in her throat. Her mother was speaking to her, though the words were muffled, as if coming from underwater. She handed Nina something, a small, worn locket. Keep this close, her mother said, her voice echoing faintly. It will always guide you home. Nina reached for her neck instinctively, but the locket wasn't there. The memory shifted, and her mother's expression changed. The kindness in her eyes was replaced by fear, and she pulled Nina close, as a shadow fell over them. The water rippled violently, breaking the image apart. Nina gasped, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder now, overlapping and chaotic. The locket, the lake, the truth. She looked down at the rabbit in her hands and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint glimmer of metal poking out from a tear in its fabric. Her hands trembled as she pulled at the seam, revealing a small, tarnished locket hidden inside. The moment she touched it, a sharp pain shot through her head, and the world around her seemed to spin. The whispers surged, their voices overlapping in a deafening cacophony. Remember! Remember the truth! Nina clutched the locket tightly, her vision blurring as another memory surfaced. She saw herself running through the village as a child, her mother's voice calling after her. The bell was ringing, its chime echoing through the mist. And then she saw the figure with the glowing eyes. It was chasing her. The memory ended abruptly, and Nina stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. The lake's surface was still again, but the air around her felt heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She knew now that the locket was the key, but she didn't understand how. The whispers softened, their tone almost pleading now. Go to the clock tower. The final toll. Nina's grip on the locket tightened. She didn't want to go back to the tower, but she knew she didn't have a choice. Taking one last look at the still waters of the lake, she turned and began walking. The path back to the village felt longer this time, the mist thicker and darker. The locket felt warm in her hand, its faint glow guiding her through the shadows. When she reached the village square, the clock tower loomed above her, its cracked face frozen at the same time as before. 11:59. The door was open, the faint glow of candlelight spilling out onto the cobblestones. Nina took a deep breath and stepped inside. The tower's interior was darker than before. The faint glow of candlelight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that twisted and danced along the cracked walls. The air was colder now, the damp smell of mildew and earth stronger. Nina clutched the locket tightly in her hand as she stepped onto the spiral staircase. The wood creaked beneath her weight, the sound echoing through the hollow space above. Each step felt heavier, her legs trembling as she ascended. The whispers returned, faint and mournful, their voices drifting through the air like a distant breeze. Time, lost, forgotten. When Nina reached the top of the tower, the massive bell loomed before her, its tarnished surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The rope swayed gently, though there was no wind. But something was different this time. Standing next to the bell was the figure, tall, thin, and cloaked in shadow. Its glowing eyes bore into her, filling the room with an oppressive dread. "You've come far," the figure said, its voice low and guttural. Nina's breath hitched. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its grin sharp and cruel. "You already know who I am," it said, "and what I want is the truth." The locket in Nina's hand grew warmer, its glow intensifying. The figure's eyes flicked to the small object, and its grin faltered. "That doesn't belong to you," it hissed, stepping closer. "Give it to me." Nina shook her head, taking a step back. "This locket, it was my mother's. She gave it to me." The figure's laughter was sharp and grating, echoing through the room. "Your mother was a fool," it said. "She thought she could escape. But the village always takes what it's owed." Nina's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" The figure's eyes narrowed, its form flickering like a dying flame. "The bell binds us all," it said. "Ring it, and you'll see." Nina's gaze shifted to the rope dangling from the bell. The whispers grew louder now, overlapping and chaotic, urging her forward. "Ring the bell. The truth awaits." She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the rope. The figure stepped closer, its voice sharp and commanding. "Do it," it said. "Ring the bell and face what you've forgotten." Nina's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't trust the figure, but the whispers called to her, pulling her toward the bell. With a deep breath, she gripped the rope and pulled. The bell let out a deafening chime, its sound reverberating through the air like a shockwave. The world around her shattered, the tower dissolving into darkness. Nina fell to her knees, her head pounding as memories flooded her mind, fragments of a life she had buried deep within herself. She saw her mother, her kind eyes filled with fear as she handed Nina the locket. She saw the village, shrouded in mist, its streets filled with shadowy figures. And she saw herself, a child running through the cobblestone streets as the bell tolled in the distance. The figure with glowing eyes had been there, chasing her, always just out of reach. The memories sharpened, and Nina gasped as the truth hit her. She had been here before. The village wasn't just a strange place she had stumbled upon. It was where her mother had brought her to hide. "To hide from it," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, its shadowy form looming over her. "Now you understand," it said. "This place isn't just a village. It's a prison. And you were meant to stay." Nina shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said. "My mother took me away. She broke the cycle." The figure's grin widened, its glowing eyes narrowing. "But you came back," it said. "And now, you belong to me." The locket in Nina's hand grew unbearably hot, its glow blinding. The whispers surged, their voices rising in a chaotic symphony. "Break the bell! End the cycle! Free the lost!" Nina's grip tightened around the locket as she looked up at the figure. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. "I don't belong to you. I belong to my mother, to her love." The figure let out a furious roar, its form twisting and writhing as it lunged at her. But Nina didn't flinch. She raised the locket, its light piercing through the darkness. The light engulfed the room, and the figure screamed, its shadowy form dissolving into smoke. The bell cracked, its surface splintering as the sound of the chime faded into silence. The whispers softened, their tone mournful but relieved. "Thank you. Thank you." When the light faded, Nina found herself standing in the village square once more. The mist was gone, the air lighter and warmer. The houses were no longer dark and decayed, but bright and welcoming. And the figures that had haunted her were gone. Nina looked down at the locket in her hand, its glow faint but steady. She had done it. She had broken the cycle. But as she turned to leave the village, a faint whisper drifted through the air. Not all who are lost can be saved. Nina's heart ached, but she knew she couldn't stay. With one last glance at the clock tower, she stepped onto the road, the sunlight guiding her way. She didn't look back. The road stretched endlessly before her, the trees arching overhead to form a tunnel of golden light. For the first time, the mist was gone. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had clung to her since she entered the village finally lifted. But Nina couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly free. The whispers were gone, and the locket in her hand was cool now, its glow faint but constant. It had saved her, guided her, but she knew the journey wasn't over. The shadows of the village lingered at the edge of her thoughts, fragments of memories she couldn't fully grasp. What had the whisper meant? Not all who are lost can be saved. As she walked, the road began to shift. The cobblestones became smoother, their jagged edges softening until they resembled polished stone. The trees thinned, revealing an open field bathed in an unnatural golden light. At the center of the field stood a single figure. Nina froze, her heart pounding as she recognized the tall, shadowy form. Its glowing eyes burned into her and a cruel grin spread across its face. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" the figure said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Nina's grip tightened around the locket. "I destroyed the bell," she said. "I broke the cycle. You're supposed to be gone." The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You broke the bell," it said, "but the bell wasn't the source. It was just a piece of the puzzle." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the golden light dimmed. Shadows crept across the field, curling like tendrils toward Nina. "You see," the figure continued, "the village isn't just a place. It's a memory, a fragment of something far greater. And you," it stepped closer, its grin widening, "you're part of it now?" Nina took a step back, her chest tightening. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not like you. I don't belong to this place." The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Don't you?" it asked. "Your mother tried to protect you, but in the end, she failed. You came back, and now you're trapped, just like everyone else." Nina's mind raced. The locket pulsed faintly in her hand, its glow flickering like a dying flame. "I'm not trapped," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I still have the locket. I still have a way out." The figure's grin faltered, its shadowy form flickering. "You think that trinket can save you?" it sneered. "It's just a symbol, a tether to the past. It can't protect you from the truth." "What truth?" Nina demanded. The figure's laughter echoed again, louder this time. "That you were never meant to leave," it said. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Nina's legs like vines. She struggled against them, her heart racing as the figure loomed over her. The locket grew warmer in her hand, its faint glow intensifying. Nina closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth, the memory of her mother's voice. "Keep this close. It will always guide you home." The shadows recoiled slightly, their grip loosening. "Home," Nina whispered. "That's what this is about. This place isn't my home. It never was." The figure snarled, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You can't deny what you are," it hissed. "You're part of this. You've always been part of this." The locket's glow intensified, filling the field with a brilliant light. Nina opened her eyes, her grip tightening around the locket. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not part of this. My mother took me away from this place, and I'm taking myself away now." The figure roared, its form twisting and writhing as the light consumed it. "You can't escape," it howled. "The village is in your blood. It will always find you." The shadows dissolved into smoke, and the ground beneath Nina's feet steadied. The golden light returned, brighter than before, washing over the field like a wave. When the light faded, Nina was standing on the road again. The field was gone, replaced by the familiar trees and the soft rustling of leaves. The locket in her hand was cool and still, its glow extinguished. Nina took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as the tension in her body eased. She didn't know if the figure's words were true, but she didn't care. The road stretched ahead of her, endless and uncertain, but it was hers to walk. She turned her back on the village and began to move forward, her steps steady and sure. As the trees thinned, the faint outline of a house appeared in the distance. It wasn't the village. It was something new, something real. The sight filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Nina allowed herself to believe she could leave the past behind. But as she reached the house, a faint sound drifted through the air, a bell ringing softly in the distance. Nina froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon. The mist was gone, the trees still, but the sound of the bell lingered, faint and haunting. The whispers returned, soft and melodic, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. Not all who are lost can be saved. Nina's hand tightened around the locket as she faced the road ahead. She didn't look back.